November 14, 1944, 7:23 in the morning. Oberingenieur Klaus Richter stood in the cold rain at Castle Test Ground, his breath turning to mist in the freezing air. Before him sat a Sherman tank, serial number 23447, dragged from the battlefield in France 3 days earlier. Bullet scars popped that made sense. Before the war, he'd designed production lines for Volkswagen back when Germany still made cars for ordinary people instead of machines for killing them. He had one religion in life: he hated waste. Wasted steel, wasted motion, wasted time. Now he stood before this American tank, and something about it bothered him deeply. It looked wrong. The armor seemed too thin, the gun barrel too short. The whole thing sat too tall, like someone had stacked boxes on a tractor chassis and called it a weapon of war. His team stood behind him, young engineers and welders waiting for him to speak. Klaus said nothing. He walked around the Sherman slowly, his boots splashing in puddles. He ran his hand along a weld seam, rough, unfinished, the kind of work that would get a man fired from a Volkswagen line. But here was the thing that Klaus couldn't explain. The thing that had brought him to this test ground on a miserable November morning. This ugly, poorly made tank kept winning. Not occasionally, not sometimes, always. General Otto Brenner had given Klaus 2 weeks. Find the secret. Find whatever trick the Americans had hidden inside this machine. Find the special alloy, the new technology, the engineering breakthrough that explained why German Panther tanks, superior in every measurable way, were losing to these tin boxes. 2 weeks. Or Klaus would be reassigned to a combat engineering unit on the Eastern Front, which at this stage of the war was basically a death sentence for a 45-year-old factory engineer. Klaus touched the Sherman's armor one more time. The metal was cold and wet. "Let's begin," he said. 4 months earlier, July 9th, 1944, a hedgerow in Normandy, France, 6:45 in the morning. Lieutenant Marcus Adler sat in the commander's cupola of his Panther tank, scanning the French countryside through his periscope. He was 28 years old, young for a tank commander, but he'd survived 2 years on the Eastern Front, which made him practically ancient by Wehrmacht standards. The Panther crouched behind a thick hedgerow, completely hidden. Marcus had positioned his tank perfectly, overlapping fields of fire, clear sightlines down the lane. The morning mist was just beginning to lift. Through his periscope he saw them coming. 3 American Sherman tanks moving down a narrow road between the hedgerows. They looked awkward to Marcus, too tall, too boxy, like moving barns with tracks underneath. His gunner, a corporal named Heinrich, whispered, "Easy targets, Herr Leutnant." Marcus had heard that before. Everyone said Shermans were easy targets, thin armor, weak guns, prone to catching fire when hit. The Americans called them Ronsons after the cigarette lighter because they lit up on the first strike. But Marcus had learned not to underestimate easy targets. "Target left," he ordered quietly. "First Sherman, range 400 meters. The gun swung smoothly. The Panther's long 75mm barrel was a beautiful piece of engineering capable of punching through Sherman armor from a kilometer away. "Steady," Marcus said. Heinrich exhaled slowly. "Fire." The gun roared. The shell crossed the distance in less than a second and slammed into the lead Sherman's hull. The American tank erupted immediately. Flame and black smoke poured from the turret hatches. Marcus saw a crewman bail out his uniform on fire. The second Sherman jerked to a halt, its commander clearly confused about where the shot had come from. It began reversing awkwardly, trying to find cover. "Next one," Marcus ordered. "Hurry." Another shot. Another Sherman stopped moving, smoke billowing from its engine deck. The third Sherman tried to ram through the hedgerow to escape its tracks, grinding and scraping against roots and earth. It got halfway through before Marcus's third shot caught it in the side. The tank shuddered and went silent. 3 Shermans, 3 kills, less than 2 minutes. Heinrich grinned. "Like shooting rabbits, Herr Leutnant." Marcus said nothing. He'd learned to wait. And sure enough, 2 hours later, when the smoke had cleared and Marcus was preparing to relocate his position, he heard the rumble of more engines. He raised his periscope and looked east down the road. 11 more Shermans were coming. Not 3, not 5, 11. That was the moment Marcus understood something fundamental had changed in this war. It wasn't about who had the better tank anymore, it was about who had more tanks. By sunset that day, his Panther had knocked out 7 Shermans total. But when darkness fell, and Marcus finally pulled back to rearm and refuel, he could still hear American engines in the distance. More of them, always more. That night, sitting on the hull of his Panther, while his crew slept, Marcus took out his journal and wrote a single sentence. "We won the duel, they won the math." He didn't know how right he was. The next 3 weeks were a nightmare of the same pattern. Marcus's unit would set up perfect ambushes. They would knock out Shermans with methodical precision. The German tanks were simply better. Better armor, better guns, better optics. In any individual engagement, the Panther was superior. But it didn't matter. For every Sherman they destroyed, 2 more appeared. For every perfect ambush, there was another wave of American armor rolling forward. The Shermans kept coming, kept pushing, kept dying, and kept being replaced faster than Marcus could count. On July 28th, Marcus's Panther took a hit that wounded him and killed his driver. The shell came from a Sherman that had flanked their position while Marcus was engaging targets to his front. It was a lucky shot, really. The Sherman's 75mm gun shouldn't have penetrated the Panther's side armor at that angle, but war is filled with unlucky geometry. The shell didn't penetrate completely, but the impact sent shrapnel through the driver's compartment. Marcus took a piece of metal in his shoulder, nothing life-threatening, but enough to get him evacuated to a field hospital and then sent back to Germany for recovery. As they loaded him into the medical truck, he looked back at his Panther. It sat there smoking damaged, but not destroyed. A repairable wound. But where would they find the parts? Where would they find the time? Where would they find another crew? The Americans he knew didn't worry about these questions. They just brought another Sherman. August 1944, a hospital in Kassel, Germany. Marcus's wound healed quickly. The doctors wanted to keep him for observation, but the Wehrmacht needed experienced tank commanders. After 2 weeks, an orderly came with new orders. "You're being temporarily reassigned, Lieutenant Adler." Marcus read the paperwork. Technical Testing Division, some kind of special project. He was to report to a facility on the outskirts of Kassel. The next morning, a driver took him to what looked like an industrial warehouse surrounded by high fences and guards. Inside, the space was divided into testing bays. Marcus saw pieces of destroyed equipment, shattered gun barrels, blown tank treads, armor plates with holes punched through them. And in the center of the largest bay, under bright lights, sat an intact American Sherman tank. A man in civilian clothes was examining it, taking notes in a leather journal. He was in his mid-40s with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He moved around the Sherman with the careful attention of a doctor examining a patient. An officer approached Marcus. "Lieutenant Adler, I'm Hauptmann Victor Strauss. Welcome to the technical assessment facility." He gestured toward the man examining the Sherman. "That's Oberingenieur Klaus Richter. He's going to figure out what makes these damned things so effective." Marcus watched Klaus for a moment. The engineer was running his hand along a weld seam, frowning. "What's he looking for?" Marcus asked. Victor shrugged. "Secret armor composition, advanced metallurgy, some new American innovation we haven't discovered yet." He lit a cigarette. "Personally, I think he's wasting his time. The Americans just have more factories than we do. But General Brenner thinks there must be some technical advantage we're missing." Marcus walked closer to the Sherman. Klaus glanced up at him. "You're the tank commander they sent?" Klaus asked. "Lieutenant Marcus Adler, Herr Oberingenieur." Klaus nodded. He didn't seem particularly impressed by military rank. "Tell me about fighting these machines." Marcus thought about the 3 weeks in Normandy. "They're easy to kill," he said. "Thin armor, weak gun, catch fire easily." "Then why are we losing?" Klaus asked simply. Marcus hesitated. It was a dangerous question to answer honestly. Suggesting that Germany was losing could be considered defeatism, which could get you court-martialed. But Klaus was looking at him with genuine curiosity, not political judgment. "Because they have more," Marcus said quietly. "Many more." Klaus nodded slowly. "Yes, that's what I thought." He turned back to the Sherman. "Everyone wants me to find the secret weapon hidden inside this tank. The special armor. The advanced technology." He tapped the hull with his knuckle. It made a hollow sound. "But I don't think the secret is in the armor, Lieutenant. I think the secret is in why this tank exists in the first place." "Why it can be here broken and burned and still matter, still win." Marcus frowned. "I don't understand." Klaus smiled slightly. It was a sad smile. "Neither do I. Not yet. But I'm going to find out." He picked up a piece of chalk and drew a line across the Sherman's hull. "In engineering, Lieutenant, we often look for the wrong things. We look for the spectacular, the innovative, the perfect." He drew another line, marking where they would cut into the armor. "But sometimes," Klaus said, "the real innovation is in making something good enough, and then making it 10,000 more times." Victor Strauss approached them. "Oberingenieur Richter, General Brenner wants a progress report by the end of the week." Klaus didn't look up from his markings. Tell the general that finding secrets takes time. You have 2 weeks, Victor said. After that, the general is reassigning resources, including you. Klaus finally looked at Victor. Where would he reassign me? Does it matter we're losing on every front? Everywhere needs engineers. Klaus turned back to the Sherman. Then I'd better work quickly. That night, Klaus couldn't sleep. He lay in his small apartment near the facility, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the Sherman. He'd spent his entire career building things efficiently. In the 1930s, when he worked for Volkswagen, his job was to design assembly processes that could produce cars quickly and cheaply. He'd studied American methods, Ford's assembly line, standardized parts, interchangeable components. Germany had never really embraced those ideas. German engineering prized precision, craftsmanship, making each piece perfect even if it took longer. Klaus had always believed there was another way. Make things good enough, make them fast, make them in quantity. But he'd never been able to convince his bosses. They always wanted the extra precision, the tighter tolerances, the additional features. And now Germany was at war, and Klaus was looking at an American tank that embodied everything he'd been trying to teach for years. Good enough. Fast. Quantity. He got out of bed and made notes by lamplight. The Sherman's armor wasn't special. He could already see that. It was cast steel, moderately thick, nothing exotic. The gun wasn't special either. A 75mm less powerful than the Panther's weapon. So why did it keep winning? Klaus wrote in his journal. The question is not what this tank is. The question is what this tank does. And the real question is what system allows it to do that. He underlined the word system 3 times. The next morning, Klaus assembled his team. There were 5 of them, 3 younger engineers, a welder and a machinist. And now Marcus, the tank commander, who'd actually fought against Shermans. The youngest engineer was Gefreiter Lucas Hartmann, 22 years old, fresh from a technical school before being drafted. He had the confidence of youth and limited experience. Klaus stood before the Sherman. Gentlemen, we have 2 weeks to understand this machine. Not just its parts, but its purpose, its philosophy. Lucas snorted. Philosophy. It's a tank, Herr Oberingenieur. Steel and guns. Klaus looked at him mildly. Everything made by humans has a philosophy embedded in it, Gefreiter. The question is whether we're smart enough to read it. He gestured to the cutting torches. Today we open it up, but before we cut, I want each of you to examine it. Touch it. Look at the welds, the plates, the assembly. Tell me what you see. The team spread out around the Sherman. They examined welds, measured plate thickness, studied how components connected. After 20 minutes, Klaus called them together. What did you see? He asked. Lucas spoke first. The welding is sloppy, Herr Oberingenieur. Poor finish work. Many of the plates are cast instead of rolled. The whole construction seems rushed. Klaus nodded. Yes. What else? The machinist, an older man named Friedrich, spoke up. The armor is thinner than our Panther. The angles are good in places, but not optimal. This tank sacrifices protection for other priorities. What priorities? Klaus asked. Friedrich shrugged. Weight, perhaps. Easier transport. Klaus turned to Marcus. Lieutenant, you fought these. What do you see? Marcus walked around the Sherman one more time. He thought about the 11 tanks that had appeared after he'd knocked out the first 3. He thought about the constant rumble of engines in the distance, the endless columns of American armor. I see something they can afford to lose, Marcus said finally. The team went silent. Klaus smiled. Yes, exactly. You see something they can afford to lose. He picked up a cutting torch. Now let's find out why they can afford it. The torch hissed to life. Sparks showered the concrete floor as they began cutting into the Sherman's hull. The smell of burning paint and hot metal filled the workshop. When they pried back the first section of armor, Lucas leaned in to examine the edge of the plate. It's rough, he said. Not carefully machined, just cast and left. Klaus ran his finger along the casting. Large single pieces, he said. Fewer welds than our tanks, less machining required. Is that good or bad? Lucas asked. Klaus smiled slightly. That depends. Do you want perfection or quantity? He tapped the casting with his knuckle. Big pieces, fewer welds, less machining time. He looked at his team. That means more tanks per day, more tanks per factory. More tanks per year! Friedrich frowned. But the quality? The quality is sufficient, Klaus interrupted. Not excellent, not perfect, sufficient. He straightened up. And that, gentlemen, might be the first lesson. They continued cutting. As they removed more sections, Klaus began to see the pattern. The Sherman was built from large castings wherever possible. The assembly was straightforward, almost crude. But everything fit together with a brutal simplicity. This wasn't a tank designed by perfectionists. This was a tank designed by pragmatists. By the end of the first day, they had the armor mostly removed. Klaus stood back, looking at the exposed interior. "Tomorrow," he said, "we see how they built the inside. That's where the real secrets live." As the team left for the evening, Marcus stayed behind. He found Klaus making notes in his journal. "May I ask you something, Herr Oberingenieur?" Klaus looked up. "Of course." "Do you believe we can beat them, the Americans?" Klaus set down his pen. He was quiet for a long moment. "In a duel," he said finally. "One Panther against one Sherman. Yes, absolutely. Our tank is superior in almost every way." He looked at the gutted Sherman. "But war isn't a duel, Lieutenant. War is a system competing against a system. And I'm beginning to suspect that the American system was designed for a type of war we never prepared for." "What type?" Marcus asked. Klaus closed his journal. "A war where being good enough 10,000 times matters more than being perfect 1,000 times." Marcus thought about that as he walked back to his quarters. He thought about the Panther tanks broken down, waiting for parts that might never come. He thought about the Sherman columns that never seemed to stop. Maybe Klaus was right. Maybe they'd been fighting the wrong kind of war all along. And maybe, Marcus thought with a chill, it was already too late to change that. Day 2. November 15th, 1944. Klaus arrived at the workshop before dawn. He'd barely slept. His mind kept circling around what he'd seen the previous day. The crude welds, the simple castings, the lack of refinement. Everything about the Sherman offended his engineer's eye. And yet somehow that was the point. When his team arrived at 7, Klaus had already been working for an hour. He'd sketched detailed diagrams of the armor sections they'd removed, noting every weld pattern, every casting mark, every assembly point. "Today we go deeper," he told them. "Today we find out what's in the heart of this machine." Lucas Hartmann yawned. He was young enough to still be tired at 7 in the morning. "What are we looking for, Herr Oberingenieur?" Klaus thought about that. "I don't know yet, but I'll recognize it when I see it." They began removing the internal components. Seats, radio mounts, ammunition racks. Each piece came out with surprising ease. The Sherman's interior was cramped like most tanks, but Klaus noticed something odd. He could reach things. He climbed inside through the turret hatch, squeezing into the commander's position. In a Panther, everything was precisely engineered, which meant everything was precisely where it had to be, not necessarily where you'd want it. Levers required awkward reaches. Hatches needed specific sequences to open. The layout was optimal for the design, but not necessarily for the human operating it. The Sherman was different. Crude, yes. Simple, absolutely. But the controls fell naturally to hand. The hatches opened with straightforward latches. The driver's position, when Klaus crawled forward to examine it, had a logic that felt almost civilian. "This feels like a truck," Klaus murmured to himself. Marcus, who was standing outside the tank watching, heard him. "What was that, Herr Oberingenieur?" Klaus backed out of the driver's hatch. "I said it feels like a truck. A truck you can fight in." Lucas was examining the gearbox. "The transmission is very simple," he said. "Not finely tuned like our Maybach units. Robust, but crude." Klaus climbed down and looked at what Lucas had found. "Simple how? Only 5 forward gears, wide ratios, nothing optimized for specific performance bands." Lucas traced a cable routing. "And look at this. The controls are routed to avoid sharp bends, easy to adjust, easy to replace." Klaus felt something click in his mind. "Say that again?" "Easy to replace?" "Yes." Klaus examined the cable more closely. "They didn't design this to last forever. They designed it to be maintained by tired men with cold hands and limited tools." He turned to the group. "Look at the access to the transmission. In a Panther, you have to remove half the hull to reach the gearbox. Here," he pointed. 4 bolts, 30 minutes of work." Friedrich, the machinist, was examining a weld on the turret ring. "The finish work is still terrible," he said. Klaus smiled. "Finish work doesn't stop shells, Friedrich. Finish work doesn't get your broken tank off a frozen road." He ran his hand along the rough weld. "They save precision for where it matters." Where does it matter? Lucas asked. That's what we're going to find out. By midday, they'd reached the engine compartment. This was what Klaus had been waiting for. The engine was the heart of any tank. It revealed everything about the designer's priorities. They removed the rear armor plate in a shower of sparks. Behind it, the Sherman's engine waited. Lucas stared at it for a long moment. That's an aircraft engine. Klaus leaned in closer. Continental R975. Yes, a radial engine designed for aircraft. Do the Americans have so many aircraft engines they can put them in tanks? Lucas sounded genuinely confused. Klaus examined the mounting system. The engine sat on a steel cradle bolted in with standardized connections. He traced the fuel lines, the cooling system, the exhaust routing. Maybe, Klaus said. Or maybe they simply used what they had available. He pointed at the mounting cradle. But look at this. Standardized interfaces. The entire engine assembly can be removed as a single unit. He gestured to the floor of the engine compartment. See these access panels. A maintenance crew with a crane could lift this entire engine out and drop a new one in. How long, Lucas? Lucas studied the setup. With proper equipment, maybe 4 hours. 4 hours, Klaus repeated. He thought about Panther engines. Friedrich, how long does it take to change a Maybach HL230 in a Panther? The machinist grimaced. With a full workshop and experienced crew, 60 hours minimum. More if you don't have all the parts. Klaus nodded slowly. 60 hours versus 4 hours. He turned to Marcus. How often do tank engines fail in combat conditions, Lieutenant? Marcus thought about his time in Normandy. Constantly. Heat, dust, poor fuel, battle damage. On the Eastern Front, mechanical failures killed more tanks than enemy fire. And when a Panther's engine fails in the field, we tow it back, sometimes 50 kilometers to a workshop. If we can tow it, if we have fuel for the recovery vehicle, if the roads are clear. Marcus's voice was flat. Often we just blow it up and leave it. Klaus tapped the R975 engine. The Americans designed this knowing engines would fail. They built a system to replace them quickly. We designed the Panther engine to be perfect, and when perfection breaks, we abandon the entire tank. Lucas was examining a hose clamp. Herr Oberingenieur, they used the same fastener here as they used on the transmission. Klaus looked at what Lucas had found. A simple bolt, standard thread, standard size. He checked another connection. Same bolt. He moved to the cooling system. Same bolt again. How many different bolt sizes do you count in the entire engine compartment? Klaus asked. Lucas spent 10 minutes checking. 7 different sizes. 7. Klaus thought about German tanks. Specialized bolts for every application. Different sizes, different threads, different tool requirements. In a Panther engine compartment, Friedrich answered. At least 30, maybe 40. Klaus felt something profound settling over him. This is religion, he said quietly. Sir, Lucas looked confused. Standardization. It's their religion. Klaus pointed to the walls of the workshop around them. Look at our tool racks. Hundreds of different wrenches, different sizes, different shapes, each one perfect for one specific job. He turned back to the Sherman. Here, the same 7 wrenches can service half the machine. That's not laziness. That's not poor engineering. That's brilliant logistics. He pulled out his journal and began making notes. Think about it. Every American mechanic needs to carry 7 wrenches, not 40. 7. Every supply depot needs to stock 7 bolt sizes, not 40. 7. Marcus was beginning to understand. Which means fewer supply chains, fewer mistakes, fewer chances for the wrong part to delay a repair. Exactly. Klaus was writing furiously now. This is how you build 10,000 tanks and keep them running. Not by making them perfect, by making them simple enough that any mechanic with basic tools can fix them. The team spent the rest of the afternoon cataloging every component they could access. Klaus took measurements, weights, notes on every assembly method. As the day wore on, a picture began to emerge. The Sherman wasn't elegant, it wasn't optimized, it wasn't even particularly well made by German standards, but it was brilliantly practical. Every design choice favored speed of production over perfection of product. Large castings instead of precise machining. Bolted assemblies instead of welded permanents. Standard parts instead of custom solutions. By evening, Klaus sat on the workshop floor surrounded by his notes. Marcus brought him coffee. What have you learned? Marcus asked. Klaus sipped the coffee. It was terrible, but everything was terrible in Germany now. I've learned that the Americans understood something we didn't. They understood that in war, availability beats quality. He gestured at the disassembled Sherman. This tank is available. When it breaks, parts are available. When it dies, a replacement is available. It's not the best tank. It's the most available tank. Will General Brenner accept that answer? Marcus asked. Klaus laughed bitterly. No, he wants to hear about secret weapons, advanced alloys, some trick we can copy and win the war with. He stood up, his knees cracking. But I'm going to tell him the truth anyway. Day 3, November 16th, 1944. Klaus came to the workshop with a specific goal. He wanted to understand the Sherman's fire control system. How did the Americans aim and fire their guns? The turret had been partially disassembled the previous day. Now Klaus climbed inside to examine the gunner's position. The optics were good. Not exceptional, but good enough. The traverse mechanism was smooth-powered by hydraulics that seemed almost luxurious compared to the hand-cranked systems in some German tanks. But what struck Klaus was the space. The gun loader had room to work. Not much room, but enough. In a Panther, the loader had to perform gymnastics to grab ammunition from the racks and load it into the breech. Here the layout was straightforward. Uncomfortable certainly, but functional. "Lucas," Klaus called. "Come up here." The young engineer climbed into the turret. It was cramped with 2 men inside, but possible. "Pretend you're loading this gun," Klaus said. "Show me how you do it." Lucas mimed pulling a shell from the rack, turning and sliding it into the breech. His movements were awkward in the confined space, but they worked. "How many rounds could you load per minute?" Klaus asked. "I don't know, 5, 6. Klaus nodded. "A trained American loader can do 8 to 10. Not because the equipment is better, because the layout doesn't fight him." He pointed at the ammunition storage. Shells stored within easy reach. Breech at a natural working height. Enough space to turn without contortions. "It's still inferior to the Panther's gun," Lucas said. "Yes," Klaus agreed. "The 75mm can't penetrate a Panther's front armor at normal combat ranges, but it can penetrate the sides and rear. And if you can fire 8 rounds in the time it takes a Panther to fire 5, you have more chances to find those weak points." He climbed out of the turret. They didn't chase perfection. They chased sufficiency and speed. That afternoon, as Klaus was examining the radio installation, Friedrich called out. "Herr Oberingenieur, I found something." Klaus hurried over. Friedrich was kneeling beside a small compartment near the driver's position. He'd pried it open and pulled out a waterproof bag. "What is it?" Klaus asked. Friedrich opened the bag carefully. Inside was a thick booklet, the pages protected by waxed paper. English text covered the front. "A manual," Friedrich said. Klaus took it reverently, as if it were a religious text. In a way it was. This was the voice of the designers speaking directly to the crews. This would tell him more than any amount of cutting and measuring. "Can you read English?" Klaus asked. "Some," Friedrich said. "I worked in America for 2 years before the war, at a factory in Detroit." "Then translate for me." Friedrich opened the manual and began reading the cover. "TM 9759, War Department Technical Manual, Medium Tank M4A3. He flipped through the pages. Klaus leaned in, watching the diagrams flow past. Step-by-step illustrations, numbered procedures, troubleshooting charts laid out in simple decision trees. "This is not written like an engineering document," Friedrich said, surprised. "It speaks directly to the reader." He found a section and began translating aloud. Section 4-12, Track Tension Adjustment. If you hear a rattling sound from the tracks, the tension may need adjustment. Check here first. He pointed to an illustration. If that doesn't solve the problem, try this next. Lucas had joined them. He looked at the manual with contempt. "Do they think their crews are children?" Klaus didn't answer immediately. He took the manual from Friedrich and studied the pages. The language was simple, direct, almost conversational. The illustrations showed exactly what to do with arrows and numbers, making each step obvious. He turned to a section on engine maintenance. Again, the instructions assumed no prior knowledge. "If you hear this noise, it probably means this. Check here first." Klaus looked up at Lucas. "No," he said quietly. "They don't think their crews are children. They think their crews are valuable." He held up the manual. "They think a man trained to fight is too valuable to waste time figuring out why his machine won't start. So they tell him, simply, directly, like a partner explaining something to a partner." Friedrich found another section. "Here, it shows how to adjust track tension with minimal tools. 1 wrench, 1.5 inches, 20 minutes. He looked at Klaus. "This is not high art." "No," Klaus agreed. "This is not written for engineers. It's written for farmers and mechanics and boys who learned to drive a tractor last year. He set the manual down carefully on a workbench. Their secret is not hiding in the armor or the gun. It's hiding in sentences like these. He read aloud from the manual, translating as best he could. The M4 tank is a reliable machine when properly maintained. This manual will help you keep it running. Read it carefully. Your life may depend on it. Klaus looked at his team. Our technical manuals assume expertise. They assume proper facilities and trained technicians. This manual assumes a scared 18-year-old in a muddy field trying to fix his tank before the Germans attack again. Marcus, who had been listening from across the workshop, spoke up. How long does it take to train an American tank mechanic? According to this, Friedrich said, flipping through the manual, basic maintenance can be learned in 2 weeks, advanced repairs in 6 weeks. 2 weeks, Klaus repeated. He thought about German training programs. 12 weeks for basic tank maintenance, months more for specialization. We spend 10 weeks longer teaching our mechanics to maintain more complicated machines that break more often. He picked up the manual again. The Americans spend those 10 weeks teaching their men to fight, to shoot, to survive. That realization hit Klaus like a physical blow. The Sherman wasn't just a tank. It was part of a complete system, a system that assumed limited training time, limited technical expertise, limited access to specialized tools and facilities. The Sherman was designed for reality, not for ideal conditions. German tanks were designed for the perfect crew, with perfect training in perfect workshops, with unlimited access to parts and tools. American tanks were designed for farm boys and factory workers maintaining their vehicles in the field with whatever they had available. Lucas, Klaus said slowly, what happens when our perfect system encounters imperfect conditions? The young engineer thought about it. It breaks down. Yes, it breaks down. Because we built for the ideal, and war is never ideal. Klaus spent the rest of the day studying the manual. It revealed more about American military thinking than any intelligence report. Every page showed a philosophy: make it simple, make it clear, make it possible for ordinary men to succeed. There were sections on common problems and quick fixes, troubleshooting guides that any soldier could follow, preventive maintenance schedules designed around operational realities, not engineering preferences. As evening fell, Klaus sat alone in the workshop, the manual open before him. Marcus found him there an hour later. You should rest, Herr Oberingenieur. You've been here since before dawn. Klaus looked up. His eyes were tired but intense. I can't rest, Marcus, because I finally understand what we're up against. The Sherman... No. Klaus closed the manual. We're up against a system that treats its soldiers as valuable resources worth protecting, worth simplifying things for, worth giving clear instructions to. He stood and walked to the Sherman's carcass. We built a tank that requires experts to maintain. They built a tank that turns ordinary men into experts through one simple manual. He touched the rough armor plating. And that lieutenant is why they're winning. Not because their tank is better, but because their system is smarter. Marcus was silent for a long moment. What will you tell General Brenner? Klaus smiled without humor. The truth, that we can copy the shape of their parts. We can copy their assembly methods. We can even copy their manual format. He picked up his journal, filled now with notes and sketches. But we cannot copy the thinking that created all of this. We cannot copy a system that was designed from the beginning to work with human limitations instead of against them. He won't want to hear that. No, Klaus agreed. He won't, but it's the truth. And I've spent my whole life building things based on truth, not wishes. Outside, the November rain had started again. Klaus could hear it drumming on the warehouse roof. Somewhere in France, American Sherman tanks were rolling forward through that same rain, breaking down, being repaired, being replaced. And German Panther tanks were breaking down too, but without simple manuals, without quick change engines, without standardized parts. The math was brutal and clear. Klaus looked at the manual one more time before putting it in his satchel to study at home. On the cover, stamped in English, War Department, United States Army. Such simple words. But they represented something. Germany had never built a system designed for the war. They were actually fighting, not the war they wished they were fighting. Day 4 would bring more discoveries. But Klaus already knew the most important truth. The Sherman's real secret was that it had no secrets at all, just ruthless practical clarity about what war demanded. And Germany, for all its engineering brilliance, had never learned that lesson. November 20th, 1944. 1 week into the investigation. Klaus had written his report. 47 pages, diagrams, measurements, calculations, and at the end, a conclusion that would displease everyone who read it. The conference room at the testing facility was cold. Someone had tried to heat it, but coal was scarce now, even for military facilities. 8 officers sat around a long wooden table, their breath visible in the frigid air. At the head of the table sat General Major Otto Brenner, 60 years old, with iron-grey hair and eyes that had seen too many defeats lately. Klaus stood before them, his report stacked neatly on the table. Marcus sat in the back of the room, technically present as a technical advisor, but really just there to watch what happened when Klaus told powerful men things they didn't want to hear. "Gentlemen," Klaus began, "I have completed my analysis of the American M4 Sherman tank." Brenner leaned forward. "And what is their secret?" Klaus took a breath. "The Sherman's armor is adequate but not remarkable, sloped in many places, strong enough against some guns, not against others." An officer with a Panzer badge on his collar frowned. "We already know this. Why does it matter how it's built?" Klaus met his gaze. "Because the armor is not why the tank keeps coming back." He moved to his first chart, showing the Sherman's internal layout. The engine is powerful enough but not especially efficient, not especially advanced, but it is mounted in a way that makes replacement simple. Field replacement. 4 hours instead of 60. A staff officer with narrow eyes interrupted. "And the gun? The standard 75mm is inferior to ours in penetration," Klaus said. He let that statement sit for a moment. "But it is mounted in a turret that rotates quickly with optics that are good enough and with space for the loader to work without gymnastics." He paused. "They did not chase perfection. They chased sufficiency and repeatability." A colonel snorted. "You are praising them." Klaus shook his head. "I am describing them. What you hear as praise is merely our failure to do the same." The room stiffened. Several officers shifted uncomfortably. Criticizing German engineering was dangerous territory. Klaus continued before anyone could interrupt. "The true secret of this tank is that it was never designed to be the best tank." He looked each man in the eye. "It was designed to be built by the thousands maintained by ordinary men and replaced faster than we can plan a counterattack." He tapped his report. "It is a cog in a machine that begins in their factories and ends where our fuel and ammunition run out." Brenner's face was stone. "Are you telling me we cannot defeat it? I am telling you that defeating one Sherman is easy. Defeating 10,000 Shermans is mathematics, not military prowess." Klaus opened his report to a page of production figures. In 1943, the Americans produced 21 245 Sherman tanks, Sherman. In the same year, we produced 5 the 976 Panther and Tiger tanks combined. He let those numbers sink in. In 1944, they will produce approximately 17,000 more Shermans. We will produce perhaps 6,000 Panthers and Tigers. A major spoke up. "But our tanks are superior in combat." "Yes," Klaus agreed. "In individual combat, the Panther is superior. But, gentlemen, war is not a series of individual combats. It is a system competing against a system." He pulled out another chart. "To produce one Panther requires 55,000 man-hours. To produce one Sherman requires 10 400 man-hours." Klaus did the math on the chalkboard. "With the same effort we spend building one Panther, the Americans can build 5 Shermans. And 5 Shermans properly used will defeat one Panther, every time." The room was silent now. The only sound was the wind outside and the scratch of Klaus's chalk on the board. "But surely there must be a weakness we can exploit," Brenner said. His voice was quieter now, less certain. Klaus turned to face him. "Their weakness is that each individual Sherman can be destroyed, but that is also their strength, because they have built a system that can afford to lose Shermans." He closed his report. "We built masterpieces, beautiful, powerful, precisely engineered masterpieces. And then we sent them into a war where masterpieces die just as easily as anything else." Klaus picked up the American field manual and held it up. "This document tells their crews how to maintain and repair their tanks using simple language and clear illustrations. It assumes the crew has minimal training and limited tools. It is written to help ordinary men succeed." He set it down. "Our manuals assume expert knowledge and ideal conditions. Which philosophy do you think works better in the chaos of war?" Brenner stood slowly. "Oberingenieur Richter, you have done thorough work, but this is not the answer I hoped for." "No, sir," Klaus said. "It is not, but it is the truth. Can we copy any of this? Their manufacturing methods? Their simplified design?" Klaus thought for a long moment. "We can copy the shape of the parts. We can copy some assembly methods, but we cannot copy what makes the Sherman truly dangerous." "And what is that?" "The ability to treat a tank, not as a precious jewel, but as a consumable tool." Klaus's voice was steady. They built a tank that an economy like theirs can afford to lose 10,000 times, and they built an economy that can afford to lose them. He looked around the room. We built masterpieces. Then we discovered that war does not care about masterpieces. War cares about what arrives tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Brenner's face tightened. He seemed older suddenly. Continue your documentation, Oberingenieur. Even if we cannot use it to win, perhaps it will help history understand why we lost. The meeting ended. The officers filed out, most of them avoiding eye contact with Klaus. Only Hauptmann Victor Strauss stayed behind. That took courage, Victor said quietly. Klaus began gathering his papers. It took honesty. Courage would have been saying this 5 years ago before we committed to the Panther design. Would anyone have listened? Klaus smiled sadly. No. We Germans love our perfection too much. We always have. March 12th, 1945. 4 months later. The war was collapsing. Everyone knew it now, even if no one would say it aloud. The Americans had crossed the Rhine. The Soviets were advancing from the east. Germany was being crushed between two massive industrial powers, both of whom had learned to build weapons faster than Germany could destroy them. Klaus received a message that Marcus Adler had requested his presence at a site near the front lines. A damaged Panther needed evaluation for possible recovery. Klaus arrived to find Marcus standing beside Panther number 424. The tank sat motionless in a muddy field, its engine silent, its gun pointed at nothing. It looked intact. No battle damage, no fire marks. Engine failure, Marcus said as Klaus approached. 2 days ago. We need a specialized bearing from the transmission. The part is on order from the factory. How long? Klaus asked. 6 weeks, maybe 8, if the factory is still operating, if the railways are running. If the part exists. Klaus walked around the Panther. It was a beautiful machine. Sloped armor, powerful gun, designed with precision and care, and utterly useless, sitting broken in a muddy field. How many days did this tank fight? Klaus asked. 9, Marcus said. 9 days of combat before a bearing failed. Klaus looked at the serial number plate. Panther 424, built in January 1945, less than 2 months old, dead from a single failed part that cost perhaps 20 Reichsmarks. You know what the Americans would do, Klaus said. Marcus nodded. They would swap the entire engine in 4 hours and have the tank back in action by tomorrow. They stood in silence for a moment. Around them, the sounds of distant artillery rumbled like thunder. Marcus climbed up onto the Panther's hull and sat down. Klaus joined him, 2 men sitting on a dead tank in a dying country. You were right, Marcus said, about everything. We built art. They built tools. Klaus looked at the Panther's graceful lines. And art needs museums. Tools need to be used. He was quiet for a moment. In another time, under different circumstances, the Panther would have been recognized as a triumph of engineering. But not in this time. No, not in this time. Klaus thought about the Sherman, its crude welds and simple systems. In this time, the winner is whoever can put more working tanks on the battlefield tomorrow, not whoever builds the most beautiful tank today. Marcus stared at the horizon. Last week, my unit destroyed 11 Shermans. We celebrated, thought we'd won a great victory. What happened? We had to retreat 2 days later, out of fuel and ammunition. And as we pulled back, I saw more Shermans moving up. Not 11, not 20, more than I could count. He turned to Klaus. We killed 11. They brought 50. That's the war now. That's always been the war. We just didn't want to see it. Klaus pulled out his old journal, the one where he'd documented the Sherman investigation. The pages were worn now, stained with oil and dirt. He flipped to a page near the end. I wrote something here, he said, after I finished the report. Let me read it to you. He found the passage. A tank like the Sherman need not be superior to any one of ours. It need only be good enough to do its job and be followed by another and another and another. Klaus closed the journal. I thought I was being clever, insightful, but really I was just stating the obvious. The Americans understood from the beginning what we never learned, that war is decided by logistics, not by genius. A truck approached, grinding through the mud. A young lieutenant jumped out. Lieutenant Adler, we need to move. Enemy aircraft spotted to the west. Marcus stood. Understood. 5 minutes. The lieutenant looked at the Panther. Are we recovering it? Marcus and Klaus exchanged glances. Both knew the answer. No crane, no transport, no parts, no time. No, Marcus said. Prepare it for demolition. We can't let the Americans capture it intact. The lieutenant nodded and walked away to organize the charges. Klaus climbed down from the Panther. He ran his hand along its armor one last time. Panther 424. 9 days of service. Killed by a 20 Reichsmark bearing. How many Shermans do you think died from bearing failures? Marcus asked. Thousands, probably, Klaus said. But they just swapped in a new engine and kept fighting. They walked away from the Panther. Behind them, engineers were placing demolition charges. By tomorrow, this beautiful machine would be a pile of twisted metal. If you could design a tank now, Marcus said, knowing everything you know, what would you build? Klaus didn't hesitate. I would build the Sherman. Simple, reliable, easy to maintain, easy to replace. And would Germany accept it? Klaus laughed bitterly. No. They would reject it as insufficiently advanced, lacking in innovation, not worthy of German engineering. He looked back at the Panther one last time. We would rather lose with a masterpiece than win with something ordinary. May 8th, 1945. Germany surrendered. Klaus found himself in American custody, not as a prisoner exactly, but as someone of interest. Engineers who had studied American equipment were valuable for intelligence purposes. Major Robert Hayes interviewed him in a makeshift office in what had once been a German administrative building. Hayes was younger than Klaus expected, maybe 35, with an easy manner that seemed out of place in the ruins of defeated Germany. I've read your report on the Sherman, Hayes said in accented but clear German. How did you get hold of that? Someone in intelligence circles thought it was interesting, Klaus said. I suspect they thought it might be useful for propaganda, showing that even German engineers had to admit defeat. Hayes smiled. And instead, you wrote something honest. I am an engineer. I deal in facts. Hayes opened a folder. Your report impressed some people in Washington. You understood the Sherman better than most of our own engineers. You saw the philosophy, not just the mechanics. It was not difficult once I stopped looking for secrets, Klaus said. The Sherman has no secrets, just clarity about what war requires. Hayes leaned back in his chair. We're going to need people like you. Germany has to be rebuilt. Factories, infrastructure, all of it. I am a tank engineer. No, Hayes corrected gently. You are an industrial systems engineer who happened to analyze a tank. That's different. He pulled out a document. There's a position available, advisory role, helping reorganize German industrial production, civilian work, automobiles, not weapons. Klaus thought about the Panther sitting broken in a field, about the Sherman's simple elegance, about the manual written for farm boys. I accept, he said. 1952. 7 years after the war ended. Marcus Adler stood in front of a classroom at a German university. He was 36 years old now, with a professor's title and a limp from his old wounds. His students, young men who barely remembered the war, listened as he taught military history. Today's lesson was about tank warfare. He had brought a guest. Klaus Richter, now 53, slightly heavier with more grey in his hair. Klaus worked for Volkswagen again, helping redesign their production systems. Professor Adler has invited me, Klaus told the students, to talk about engineering and war, about the difference between winning a battle and winning a war. He showed them photographs. A Panther tank, a Sherman tank, side by side. Which is the better tank? Klaus asked. Several students immediately said the Panther. Superior armor, better gun, more advanced. You are correct, Klaus said. In a duel 1 against 1, the Panther wins most of the time. He let that sink in. So why did Germany lose the tank war? Silence from the students. Klaus put up another photograph. A factory floor in Detroit, 1944. Dozens of Sherman tanks in various stages of assembly stretching as far as the camera could see. Because war is not a duel. War is production. War is logistics. War is the ability to replace losses faster than they occur. He told them about his investigation, about the crude welds and simple systems, about the manual written for ordinary soldiers, about engines that could be swapped in hours instead of days. The Americans did not build a better tank, Klaus said. They built a better system, a system that could lose 5 tanks and replace them with 8, a system that treated machines as tools, not treasures. One student raised his hand. But if we knew this, why didn't we change? Klaus smiled sadly. Because we are German. We pursue perfection. We build masterpieces, even when what the situation requires is something good enough repeated endlessly. Marcus spoke up. I fought against Shermans for months, destroyed many of them, but they kept coming. And eventually I understood I was fighting the wrong war. I was trying to win individual battles. They were winning the campaign through sheer weight of material. After class, Klaus and Marcus walked across the campus. Spring was arriving, trees budding, students laughing. Germany was coming back to life slowly. "Do you ever think about that day?" Marcus asked. "When we first met, when I watched you examine the Sherman?" "Often," Klaus said. "It changed how I think about everything, not just tanks. Everything." They stopped at a memorial for students killed in the war, names carved in stone, so many names. "At Volkswagen," Klaus said, "I am applying what the Sherman taught me. Standardization, simplification, build things that ordinary people can maintain and repair." The Beetle. Yes, the Beetle. Klaus smiled. It is not a luxury car, not innovative, not exciting, but it is reliable, affordable, and easy to fix, just like the Sherman. "How many have you built?" "So far, almost 500,000. We will reach 1 million soon." Marcus whistled. "That is more than all the tanks built during the entire war." "Yes, because we learned the lesson. Finally." Klaus looked at the memorial. "All those names, all those deaths. And the lesson was simple in the real world. Good enough repeated endlessly beats perfect every time." 1973. Klaus Richter was 74 years old. He stood in a Volkswagen factory watching the assembly line move. Beetles rolled past one every 90 seconds. The 22 millionth Beetle had been produced last year. The most successful automobile design in history. A young engineer, perhaps 25, stood beside him. "Herr Richter, is it true you designed this production system?" "I designed the philosophy," Klaus said. "Other engineers implemented it." "What philosophy?" Klaus watched the cars move past. "The philosophy that perfection is the enemy of production. That standardization is more valuable than innovation. That a tool which works is worth more than a masterpiece that breaks." The young engineer frowned. "But Germany is known for precision engineering, for perfection." "Yes," Klaus agreed. "And we lost a war because of it." He told the young man about the Sherman, about the investigation in 1944, about the manual and the simple systems and the production numbers that could not be defeated. The Sherman was not invincible, Klaus said. It was worse than that. It was repeatable. The young engineer thought about that. And the Beetle. The Beetle is the Sherman of automobiles, not the fastest, not the most luxurious, not the most advanced. Klaus smiled. But available, affordable, reliable, maintainable by anyone with basic tools. They walked along the production line. Workers assembled cars with practiced efficiency, the same bolts, the same procedures. The same philosophy that an American factory worker had applied to tanks 30 years earlier. "I learned something during the war," Klaus said. "I learned that in the real world, humans matter more than machines. That a system which works with human limitations is better than a system that demands human perfection." He stopped at a quality control station. "We build Beetles that any mechanic can fix. We write manuals that any owner can understand. We use standard parts that any shop can stock." "That does not sound like German engineering," Klaus laughed. "No, it sounds like American engineering, which is why it works." The memorial ceremony was small. Klaus Richter had been awarded a medal for his contributions to German industrial recovery. He stood on a stage uncomfortable in a suit looking at the audience of factory workers and engineers and businessmen. He held up a photograph. The Sherman tank serial number 23447. "This machine," Klaus said, "taught me the most important lesson of my life. It taught me that the real world does not care about our ideals. It only cares about what works." He looked at the faces in the audience. "We Germans spent the war building perfect tanks that died for lack of a single part. The Americans built good enough tanks that kept fighting because parts were always available." He set down the photograph. "After the war, I applied that lesson. Build things that work. Build them in quantity. Build them so that ordinary people can maintain them. Do not chase perfection. Chase reliability." Klaus smiled. The result? 22 million Beetles. More than any other car in history. Built on principles I learned from a tank I once dissected in a cold warehouse in 1944. He paused. That tank was not invincible. It could be destroyed. It was destroyed thousands of times. But it was always replaced. Always. That was its secret. Not that it could not be killed, but that killing it did not matter. The audience was silent. In life, in business, in everything we build, remember this: sufficiency that can be repeated is more powerful than perfection that cannot. The Sherman proved it, the Beetle proved it again, and I suspect this lesson will remain true long after we are all gone. Klaus Richter sat down to quiet applause. He was tired. He had lived a long life, built many things, learned hard lessons, but he never forgot the Sherman. That ugly, crude, brilliant machine that had taught him what truly mattered. Years later, after Klaus died, they found his old journal from 1944, the pages where he had documented the Sherman investigation. On the last page, he had written something in careful script. November 1944. I learned today that war is not won by those who build the best weapons.
War is won by those who build weapons. Their economy can sustain, their soldiers can maintain, and their factories can replace. Everything else is vanity. And below that, added later in different ink, 1952. This lesson applies to everything, not just war, everything. The journal was donated to a museum. It sits there, still a reminder that sometimes the most important lessons come from studying your enemy's successes rather than celebrating your own failures. The Sherman tank serial number 23447 no longer exists. It was likely scrapped decades ago, melted down, turned into something else. But the lessons it taught lived on, in factory floors, in engineering schools, in the philosophy that sometimes good enough repeated endlessly is better than perfect achieved rarely. Klaus Richter understood that, and he spent the rest of his life proving it was true.